Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Sgwrs, Central South Consortium's podcast series. And today we're going to be discussing cross-curricular literacy and disciplinary literacy. I'm delighted to welcome three guests, two from the region and one from outside the region for the discussion. I'm Andy Lilford, Strategic Lead for LLC within Central South. And today with us, we have Rachel Homer, a head of maths from a large comprehensive in the region. We have Ellie Mullen-Jones from another secondary. And we also have Kathrine Mortimore, whose name might be familiar to you because she's the author of Disciplinary Literacy. And she teaches at Torquay Academy, which has an excellent track record in attainment and improving the results for socio-economically deprived students, which is clearly something that we're interested in and we support in the region. So to get us underway, we'll come to Ellie Mullen-Jones first of all. So Ellie is fairly new to the role of literacy coordinator in her secondary school. And I'm really interested in how she's found the role so far. It's been called at times one of the hardest roles in secondary school because there is so much that you can do, and often there's very little time to do it. So, Ellie, could you just get the ball rolling by talking us through your experience recently as literacy coordinator?
Yeah, so started the role in September, so still fairly new to the role, still in my first year. But it's definitely been like a bit of an eye-opener, seeing it from a whole school perspective. I am an English teacher, so before just seeing it from that like English perspective, it's definitely been sort of an eye-opener, seeing like how we can implement it whole school and what we can do whole school. I think the main thing that I've sort of learned and recognised is like the need to give like departments autonomy. So whilst I've been sort of really working hard to introduce strategies and ideas and how we can improve literacy whole school, I think it's really come to light fairly recently that the need to sort of give departments autonomy and give them like choice how they are going to implement the strategies I'm giving them. And I think that is the main takeaway for me this year, is sort of giving departments that choice. And like, for example, we did Inset Day 2 weeks ago when we came back, and we did loads of workshops. We did a carousel of loads of different strategies. So we were really fortunate to have a colleague come and do a Voice 21 sort of training session. The head of English did a vocabulary session, and I did some read and reconsidered strategies. But what I'm not saying to staff is that I want them to go away and implement all of these strategies into their subject areas, because it's just not feasible. But what I want them to do is fit the strategies to suit them and how they can improve, so they can improve, outcomes in their subject areas.
We talked, Ellie, haven't we, about this idea of push and pull with literacy. So the fact that you can push literacy as much as you like, yeah. But in many ways it's more effective, isn't it, when other disciplines or other departments actually come to you asking for advice or support that is then going to benefit their own outcomes. Is that something you've found?
Yeah, definitely. So, for example, we introduced the Freya model at the start of this year. As like a whole school approach to explicit vocabulary teaching. And I had colleagues, particularly from sort of expressive arts at sort of AOLE, who said it's really difficult for us to do this every fortnight. We only see them twice a fortnight, whereas in English, obviously we see them 8 times a fortnight. So yeah, definitely having those conversations and sort of discussing how we can adapt the strategies to best fit this subject area is really, really important. But I think that's something I've definitely learned as well, is not forcing it upon people, because I think that sort of pushes people back further. I think it's really important that we get them to recognise, and get all colleagues to recognise, that literacy actually improves outcomes in all subject areas. There's sort of the misconception or the belief that perhaps less heavy literacy subjects are not impacted as much by lower literacy levels, but we know that's not true.
I think perhaps that's a really good opportunity to bring in Rachel, and perhaps there's a link there with vocab, because I know Rachel, you're sort of quite interested in technical terminology within maths. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've seen this interaction between literacy and your specialism?
Yeah, we noticed, because the GCSEs in Wales, we actually have a numeracy GCSE and a maths GCSE, and the numeracy one has high literacy content. At one point, the paper actually had a reading age of approximately 15, and we noticed it was really quite inaccessible because of the vocabulary that was in there. So I actually brought in the Freya model as well, but we used it more as the defining mat. So it had 4 aspects to it. So you've obviously got your definition, your facts and characteristics, your examples and non-examples on there. And we did implement this, that it was actually to be used pretty much every time you were introducing a subject-specific vocabulary in the lesson. And what we did notice was the students were able to access the questions a lot more from it. But weaved through that, because we've weaved that now with the new curriculum all through year 7 and 8, we're consciously choosing to develop the literacy skills in our maths lessons. And weaving in there with something, the etymology, I hope I've said that right, and that's really quite interesting when you start drawing cross-curricular things like using oct, where that comes from, and it just throws out inconsistencies even in the English language, that actually October's the 10th month, not the 8th month. So then you start delving a little bit into the history behind it, but yeah, going off topic a little bit there, but it does link other areas in quite nicely. And also we found that it's enabled students then, if they have come across something that perhaps is outside their schema, they can maybe use that etymology skill that we've been teaching them to access those questions then from there.
Really interesting. So a couple of things that have been mentioned in the last 2 or 3 minutes that I'd like to sort of explore a little bit further if we could. So Ellie mentioned vocabulary and the importance of vocabulary, which you've picked up as well there, Rachel. And also that idea of building schema is quite interesting, and particularly kind of relevant to this drive with Curriculum for Wales of enabling students to make links between subjects. Kathrine, could I bring you in there? Take your pick. Which would you like to talk about, vocab or schema building? Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think the two are interlinked, because I think vocabulary is part of schema building, and I think that's one kind of key aspect that we've drawn out that's quite a nice way for across all subjects for everyone to feel that they're contributing towards building a student's literacy. Because if you look at the Sgwrs reading rope, one of the key elements of comprehension ultimately is the extent to which they have both the background knowledge and the vocabulary. Our homework policy is to make sure that key concepts and vocabulary are continually revisited. So we use an online program called Tassamai. There's various different options out there that basically test students' knowledge through multiple choice questions on those key concepts and vocabulary. That helps to build their background knowledge, which will be useful for literacy across all of their subjects.
That's really interesting. So that idea of background knowledge is it's gaining currency, I think, isn't it? It's being more and more recognised that both vocabulary and knowledge are so intrinsic to reading ability and comprehension. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of your approaches to vocab teaching? Because I remember I first kind of came across your work in the blog to do with the Torquay Academy dictionary, and was really interested in some of the work you'd done there.
Yeah, so I mean, it goes right back to knowledge organisers, where each department had to set out, as I know is kind of something that a lot of schools are doing now, set out like their core curriculum in a way that's accessible to students, and vocabulary has been a key part of that. And I think I was talking earlier about like words of the week and kind of introducing words and using Doug Lemov's reading reconsidered strategies to kind of make sure that there are several ways in which the students are exposed to that, but also making sure that those keywords are then revisited across the curriculum. So making sure that, let's say within history, that we're not necessarily picking as our keywords words that are transitory. So they only apply to that particular unit, but making sure that the words that we're picking are ones that are going to be useful right from year 7 all the way up to year 11. So for example, like rebellion, words that are going to be useful regardless of whether or not what year group they're in, and rather than kind of focusing on lots of terms that are going to be useful for that particular unit, but then when they move on to another unit, they're not going to need them within their armory. So it's building up those kind of more complex, transferable concepts to as in terms of choosing what vocabulary you're going to teach.
Fantastic. Just moving on. Yeah, Rachel, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just picking up on that point, actually, that was something we spotted with the exam papers. The fact that they didn't understand when they went in what calculate meant, determine a calculation mathematically. They thought it meant calculator, but yet it was a non-calculator paper. Evaluate, they didn't know what meant. Justify. And so exactly what you've done there, we've rolled it right back to year 7 and weaved that through with any exercises we do. We vary how the questions, and we consciously choose to vary how those questions are asked to build that bank of vocabulary that's needed constantly throughout 7 right through to 11 now.
Yeah, because they often will, with command words, it will vary from subject to subject as well. So evaluate within science won't mean the same thing as evaluate in English and within maths. So when you mentioned about the dictionary earlier, that's one of the things that kind of struck us when we brought all of the words together, was how important it was to have that disciplinary approach, because we talked in the past, oh, let's teach them all what each command word means. It's like, but it means something different in each subject. So we've got to be really careful of that.
Ellie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it's just really interesting to hear like the commonalities, and that was exactly the discussions we had in our school. So I had a discussion with the head of RVE, and we discussed like how explain in RVE means something completely differently to explain in English. So she went down the route of picking more sort of skills-based words for her Freya model and words of the fortnight, so that they can transfer through them. Like whilst we do it in year 7 and 8, they can transfer that through with them all the way to GCSE, and to understand that words can mean different things in different contexts and different subjects.
It's all borne out, wasn't it, by that the report from GL Assessment about that really strong link between reading age and literacy and actually outcomes in science and maths. And particularly they also talked, didn't they, about the command words and the complexity of language that's often used in the questions themselves and in the exam papers. So yeah, interesting that kind of comes up across the board, particularly from that maths perspective. Here in Wales, fairly recently, the Education Minister has talked about what he sees as 2 real priorities, which are oracy and reading. And I know, Ellie, you've touched on oracy and reading. Rachel, from a sort of maths perspective, do you see those as priorities in any way in your subject?
We do, which does surprise some people, how much emphasis we actually place in our department on the literacy skills. So when we've gone and looked at the new curriculum, we've got quite excited about it and decided to take a very fresh approach to it. And we have gone down booklets approach, but more from the point of view, it's enabled us as teachers to have the scaffolding we need to develop the literacy skills. So I've got an example here actually to share, our shape booklet that our year 8s are going to be working on. The opening paragraph, if I can just enlighten you. A polyhedron, plura polyhedra, is a 3D shape with flat faces. Every face is a polygon, a 2D shape with straight edges. The sharp corners where the edges meet are called vertices. And this is for the whole of year 8 now. We'll experience this. We're not shying away at all from the subject specific knowledge that they're needed, and we're embracing it and doing everything we can to support it and develop it. So yeah, we think it's very important, because we know we need to build that schema in order for everyone to access. With the particular cohort we have in my school, we need to make sure we develop that schema and are aware that it's actually creating a gap.
I was going to ask Kathrine if she wanted to join in there, because I know you're sort of quite a long way down that road with obviously disciplinary literacy. Is that something that you feel is now sort of embedded across different subjects? You know,
Yeah,
that element,
I feel
the reading element.
Sorry, Andy, I didn't let you finish then.
Just talking about that reading element and how you plan for that.
Yeah, so I think we've been quite fortunate that so you mentioned booklets, Rachel, like we've actually introduced workbooks. I visited Michaela School like about 8 years ago, and they use booklets, and we sort of started to use it in English, but really it was our science department, not particularly from a literacy perspective, just purely from a curriculum perspective of delivery and having that standardized approach and looking at teacher workload and all of those other things. And we found that actually having those workbooks has had a huge amount of benefits for various reasons. And from a literacy point of view, students have really benefited from having things printed in front of them as opposed to being in a PowerPoint, because PowerPoints are so transitory as far as cognitive load and things like that are concerned. Like if a teacher's reading something from a slide and the slide has got images on and text, and they're supposed to be trying to sort of process all of that at the same time, maybe being asked to make notes on what's on the board, it's actually quite difficult if you are a child, particularly with lower literacy, to be able to follow exactly what a teacher wants you to do at that point, and let alone kind of retain the information that's being imparted. So we found that having workbooks or booklets, whatever iteration you have within your schools, and particularly scripting out the exposition, like as you just sort of read out your definition and that initial part of your booklet at the beginning, just having those explanations of key processes within science that the teacher can read through, annotate, draw illustrations within science, within geography, within history, all of those different subjects. It really does increase the volume of reading that's happening every day, which is obviously going to have huge benefits.
Right. I mean, that is really interesting, because it is something that sort of from a regional perspective does come up in conversation, and there are arguments on both sides, but it's really encouraging to hear that the examples given here are very much sort of evidence-based, thought through in terms of kind of cognitive load, in terms of building those reading miles, that you know really isn't disputed, that we need our learners to be spending time reading. And I know, you know, some really interesting studies, lots of them coming out of the States, about how many minutes in a day students typically spend reading. And you know, Timothy Shanahan's basic starting point that we would hope that all of our students are reading for an hour a day. And I think that's really difficult to, first of all, to measure, but I think our gut feeling is that's probably not happening in lots of contexts. So yeah, really interesting to sort of hear that that's the route that you've gone down to as one way of solving that issue. I'm interested, because obviously we've got the three of you here today who are some way down that road of exploring disciplinary literacy, obviously at different stages, but some way down that road. And I think for anybody listening in from schools who are kind of wrestling with first steps and where to start, I'd really like to hear sort of your starting points and where it kind of began for you. Ellie, do you mind talking through, you know, when you came into the role, what did you identify as priorities? Where did you start?
So we conducted a sort of learning, start that again. We conducted a literacy learning walk in November, and sort of created lines of inquiry off that, and the focus of that was oracy. When we had a colleague come over from a primary school, they said something to me that's really resonated with me, and it is writing floats on the sea of talk. And that is something that has really stood with me, and understanding and making sure that we're using oracy to build on reading and speaking and writing skills as well. So we've really pushed that, and we've tried to introduce strategies across the school that we have sort of called non-negotiables. The first that we have said should be evident in every lesson is agree, build, challenge, so the read and reconsider strategy. So that should be evident in every lesson as a form of oracy. And also turn and talk, we said, should be in every lesson as well, that opportunity for them to have that structured opportunity to talk and discuss with a partner in order to develop their oracy or strategies in the lesson. So yeah, that has been the main focus for us at the moment, is oracy, and we're really looking now at developing that. So as I said, we've had the Voice 21 training, so lots of staff have had that. Lots of discussion around the need for sentence stems, which was something that we definitely picked up on, is that the learners with the lower literacy skills just weren't having or didn't have access to that language to be able to have a discussion with their peers. So really pushing on that. And another thing that we are sort of introducing as our next steps, which the history department are really big on at the moment, is talk like a. So they do talk like a historian, and that is using key vocabulary. Hopefully we're going to make sure it's from the Freya model and from those words that we've identified as a school. But ultimately we want to roll that out, so talk like a mathematician, talk like an author, so that we are improving their oracy skills alongside the vocabulary and using that in the correct context when they're discussing with their partners.
Fantastic. Well, speaking of talking like a mathematician, maybe we can come to Rachel and sort of where did you start, Rach, with making those links between literacy and maths, and perhaps sort of breaking the mold a little bit?
It was to do with the frustration that if I told them the skills that were needed to answer the question, they would answer it. So from a procedural point of view, for maths, they were able to do it, but they actually couldn't extract the information that was needed, which is when I started coming to talking to you a lot more, wasn't it, Andy? And so it was breaking it down that actually they couldn't access the vocabulary. So it made me consider more and reflect on my own personal teaching, which is when I stumbled across the Freya model and started using it in my classroom and shared it out across the team then. And then the second thing, picking up on what Ellie said there as well, is the turn and talk. We use that a lot, but it's more from the point of view of convince me. So again, it would be someone would say the right answer in the classroom, and often as mathematicians, we're very black and white. And so we go, great, move on. Actually, if you ask them to explain their answer, where it came from, convince me your answer's correct. So turn and talk, convince your neighbour. And if you've got a different one, often they were able to discuss and find out themselves where perhaps their misconceptions were. But again, it was developing that talk like a mathematician then. Can you do that, but using the mathematical vocabulary and constantly reinforcing it? So that's kind of where my interest came from with it.
Kathrine, how does that sort of compare with the journey, if you like, of Torquay Academy?
Yeah, I think everything that you've said is something that that is really important. So absolutely, the turn and talk, that's like a key part of what we do within our school, and kind of the cueing and making sure that that's all set up carefully, and the teachers really thought through exactly what they want each student to what role they each have within the conversation, because I think where turn and talks can sometimes go awry is where it's not clear exactly who within the pair should be saying what and what questions they should be asking, and making sure that that it's really clearly well timed, and also like how do you bring it back, so not kind of letting the conversation peter out, but almost like you want them to be at that crest of the wave with the discussion, and that's the point at which you kind of bring it back to the whole class to kind of keep that engagement going. I think that, like I say, that's one of our 3 ways to learn as we describe it. Either you're talking to your partner, you're listening to someone who's speaking, or you're writing, and those are like our 3 ways to learn. And Ellie mentioned sentence starters and frameworks, and I think that's absolutely really important that students have got that to frame their discussions, particularly if they're being asked, as Rachel says, to elaborate and expand on their ideas, and perhaps even they're encouraged not just to say this is the answer, but to always have always have the explanation as to why. And I think that that's something that I've spent a lot of time with coaching recently is exactly on that point, is that a student will give a correct answer, but it's how do you know that that's the answer, and really then bouncing it around the room, so it's not just that one student who's contributed, and you've got that confirmation that the whole class or a higher proportion of the class are on board and understand.
Absolutely, yeah, that comes back to that idea of ratio, doesn't it, that lots of schools are thankfully talking about and trying to improve ways of making sure that you've got every student involved. And just to come back to you, I mean, I'm also really interested in the link between some of your approaches and your literacy strategies and the impact that that's had. So Torquay Academy is mentioned fairly regularly in terms of some of the outcomes that you get for your most deprived or your most disadvantaged students, I suppose. Could you tell us a little bit about that link between strategy and impact?
So I think one of the things that we did a few years ago that really sort of lit a bit of a fire within our senior leadership team was we did some data analysis looking at a number of different factors that affected student outcomes over a number of years. So I think it was 2018 we did the project, and we had 5 years worth of data. So when year 11 of that year group left, we had like their reading ages from when they arrived in year 7, their postcodes, what primary school they went to, like a whole number of different factors that we looked at, what their effort scores were for homework, and what their grades were, what their SATs results were, and all of those different things. And we found that the factor that had the most profound impact was the reading age that they arrived at. And if a child arrived with a reading age that was in line with their chronological age, they actually had an 86% chance of getting 5 good GCSEs at 4 and above, whereas if they came below their chronological age, they only had like a 40% chance. And actually 40% for children with low reading ages at the time wasn't too bad, but you know, there was obviously a lot that we could do to move that forward. In terms of impact and all of the different literacy strategies that we've put in place and things like that, it is quite difficult to quantify that at a whole school level. And when we have compared to our kind of local partners, I think everyone's felt the impact of COVID. Our English results were 0.7, which we're obviously absolutely thrilled with, and that was the result I believe strongly in literature. We really focused in literature on that explicit vocabulary teaching and really hammering home those more challenging concepts, not just as one-off words of the week, but as really, really embedded concepts that then threaded through. And it was also the combination of a number of years. However, last year, it's fair to say, although our performance stood up compared to other deprived schools within the Southwest, we were still positive. It wasn't anything like what it was in 2019, and I think we have found that COVID makes it really difficult to say what the impact is now, because it's almost like, what would the impact have been if COVID hadn't happened and all of those additional factors weren't kind of thrown into the mix? Because I don't know about you guys, but we found particularly that our disadvantage gap has been hugely exacerbated by COVID, because it's those disadvantaged children who are the ones who were most likely to not come in to school and who've struggled to come back into school, who like last year, that like motivation to actually put pen to paper. We actually embarrassingly for us in the English department, our maths department results were better than our English results by a bit of a margin, actually, to be completely honest. And I think a lot of that was down to they did not attempt some of the longer answer questions within English. I think it just felt like it was too much of a mountain to climb, and it was the same across other subjects as well, where there was that more extended writing to do, that we had a core number of students who didn't attempt, whereas within maths, like I'm talking about kids who weren't necessarily our weakest students, could actually access some of the shorter answer maths questions. They maybe gave up towards the end, but actually they did persevere for more of the paper than they did for English. I mean, obviously this year this year's different again, and we're hoping that we've put a lot in place to change it. But I think it is quite difficult to talk about impact because of that huge anomalous factor that's come along that really affects our disadvantaged children.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that, because going into the range of schools that we're privileged to with CSC, that message really is coming across, and very closely linked to the point Ellie made earlier as well, I think, about those other skills floating on a sea of talk. We're really seeing, particularly reported by our primary schools, that interactive talk and sort of dialogic talk has really suffered. The levels of interaction that primary age students have had has really been knocked for six, and then further on down the line you sort of see the impact of that. I mean, I think there's so much to pick up there. I was really interested in sort of the way that data has been used, and sort of really intelligent way of analysing data and looking for those bigger trends, which with changes to curriculum and changes to assessment, certainly something that schools are grappling with at the moment is prioritising what sorts of assessment they do in terms of formative assessment and what Dylan William would call that responsive teaching, but also prioritising what data is collected and making sure that data is meaningful and then informs decisions. But perhaps even more than that, I was also really interested in those connections between sort of students coming to you in year 7 and then the way that you sort of plan for their progression, because we do have huge opportunities with the new curriculum for cluster work. So it's something that's been really promoted, and that by and large schools have really embraced, is that opportunity to plan for this sort of 3 to 16 curriculum and 3 to 16 continuum. And I know, Ellie, the cluster that you're part of has been really active there. Have you sort of seen any benefits of those discussions between primary colleagues and yourselves at secondary?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about with primary colleagues that common language for learning and like the need for them. So for example, we're doing Turn and Talk now, so there's a lot of work going on with the need for year 5, year 6 to understand what that is and what that entails. We talk a lot about sort of preparing, not always planning. And Kathrine, you've talked a lot about this, making sure that the Turn and Talk opportunities are planned for. And that is we've had a lot of discussions with primary colleagues surrounding that. So that they come to us and that they've got those skills that they need. So it's not a shock. I know when my year 7 class, for example, came to me at the start of this year, we did straight away control the game. And you could just see so many of them were so reluctant to read aloud because they haven't necessarily had that, and they've sort of maybe lost that towards the end of primary. So it's definitely something that we need to focus on moving forward, is those relationships with primary colleagues and building that common language for learning, so that they come up to us and they've already got that resilience and that stamina, reading stamina, writing stamina that we need them to have when they get to Key Stage 3.
Lovely point. If we can just finish off actually on that note with kind of next steps that you've identified within your different contexts. So Ellie, you've talked about strengthening those links and stamina building. Rachel, in terms of that maths literacy connection, have you got any sort of clear next steps or upcoming priorities?
Really, it's going to be ensuring that the students are able to explain their answers more coherently, because they're in maths. They will often admit, oh, we don't want words in maths, miss. Why are you doing that to us? Why do I have to write a sentence? Well, because you need to be very clear and order your workings in the sense of someone must be able to come along and understand what you've done. So it's having that order and being able to communicate is actually quite fundamental. So really building that connection of actually wherever you go across the curriculum, you are taking your literacy skills with you, and you need to be able to use them to your highest standard that you can.
Such a strong message, and really interesting that you bring up that aspect of sentence construction. And I know that those schools in the region who are involved with the comparative judgment project, that was probably the biggest headline coming out of that was insecurity among students, not just in Wales but across the UK, in terms of being able to define a sentence, being able to manipulate sentences, and that link between sentence construction and the ability to develop a complete thought, with sentences representing complete thoughts rather than just snatched words or phrases which aren't completely developed ideas. So really interesting connection between maths and literacy there. And then finally, Kathrine, where do you guys see yourselves going next? Have you got any immediate priorities there?
Well, you guys will be able to see, obviously it won't be on the podcast, but I'm currently in the library and that's something that has been very difficult as a result of COVID, because I don't know if other people found a similar sort of thing, but we actually ended up moving the school all around for various different reasons to keep year groups separate, and our sixth form went into our library. So then it was kind of like this movable thing, like different places we found it. So we've actually moved the library into this quite big office that's in the English department, and my major priority is to bring in a similar sort of program as we have in primary school, which is one-to-one reading with our very weakest children. Like we have it to a certain extent at the moment, but I just really want to push that forward and extend the number of children that we do that with. So in our library lessons and also in other lessons across the school, that those children that we identify who do literacy intervention but aren't making progress with it are kind of like stubborn kids. I have like this quadrant that I think of it as those kids who you've got ones with low literacy but are really trying hard, and they'll do their power up and they will make progress because they're spending a lot of time on those literacy based activities, they're using the workbooks and everything else, and then you've got the kids without literacy problems you don't need to worry about. But then you've got the core sort of group of children who've got low literacy, low effort and motivation, and it doesn't seem to matter what you try and do, they're just not engaged with the learning process across the school, so therefore they're not benefiting from workbooks, they're not benefiting from literacy intervention. So it's just trying to come up with something that's going to be, yes, it's going to be resource hungry in terms of staffing and commitment. And we did have when I tried to launch it before, we used TAs, but we found that our TAs, we've got quite a transient teaching assistant population. So we're actually, I'm hoping, I mean, everybody who does a timetable will know that this is the worst time of year to make plans for September because things change, but to actually get some English teachers timetabled purely for an hour a week to be doing one-to-one reading with our really, really vulnerable students.
Fantastic. I think there's so much there for practitioners across the Central South region, an awful lot to take there. So huge thanks to the three of you for giving up your time, especially with the pressure of exams and the pressure of just everyday teaching. So a huge thanks on behalf of CSC, very, very much appreciated, and we look forward to hearing from you and following your progress as time goes by. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Diolch am wrando ar y bennod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tanysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our online communities via our website, and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.